Great. So in terms of this workshop, we talk about how to do open inquiry with students. So before we kind of dive in, it's really important that we think about our definitions and how we describe inquiry learning. So the way that Rachel and I describe this in the book is that we have a continuum that goes from very structured learning to very open learning. And on the far left, you have direct instruction, where you don't necessarily have students investigating questions, whether they be from the teacher or the student. You have those being given through kind of, mini lessons. You're telling the students what the task is going to be. They're getting something done. Direct instruction has a role to play in the teaching continuum. It's not something that we kind of push to the side and say we don't do it for inquiry teachers. But for the sake of this workshop, we say that there's three kinds of inquiry that we would generally be moving between as educators, and that's structured inquiry, guided inquiry, and open inquiry. So the way that we describe this, you can see in the little graphics underneath the continuum, we've got kind of a larger figure, which represents the teacher, and some smaller figures, which represent the students. And so with structured inquiry, the way we talk about this is that you have one starting point in the learning and one destination that you're taking your students to. And they're all going on the same path together. So if we had to use the metaphor of like going from where I am in Dresden to, let's say, going to Berlin, we're all getting on the same train together at the same time on the same day. And we're all taking that train together from here to Berlin. And we might have some stopping points where we get off the train, get back on the train, but we basically have that same journey between Dresden and Berlin. As we move to guided inquiry, what we have is the same starting point and the same ending point in terms of the understandings we would want students to acquire, but we have many ways to get there. And those many ways may come through the case studies we allow students to investigate as part of that unit. It might be through the way that they're accessing information through different research methodologies in their communities. And so again, to use that train metaphor, let's say we're all trying to go maybe from here to Paris, a little bit further away. Some people might be going via Hamburg up to the coast and doing something there and then coming back down to Paris. Others might be going through Munich, going down and going around, but we're all getting to Paris at the end of the day. So we don't have people stopping and then saying, you know what, I'm not going to go any further. I'm going to stay in Hamburg. No, everyone joins us. And at the end, we're all in Paris, but we have different ways to get there. Now with open inquiry, you can see that there's lots of X's on that map because it means that students with the teacher's facilitation are choosing different locations to go to. So instead of all of us going from Dresden to Paris, we've got someone going to Cairo, someone going to Abu Dhabi, someone going to Finland, to Helsinki, and that is going to be determining the journey that they take in that particular inquiry. The teacher is still a facilitator there, but we do have multiple destinations that students are going to, and that means that students have more choice in that particular type of inquiry and slightly less teacher direction because we're not saying to them anymore what that destination is. They're deciding that for themselves. Over on the far end, we have discovery learning, which was a methodology defined by Jerome Bruner. This has largely been discredited as a kind of effective learning style. Discovery learning is essentially that you have the students discovering principles or generalizations just by investigating materials. And the research on discovery learning is that it doesn't necessarily happen. I mean, there's a reason why teachers exist in a classroom, because we help students find their way to be successful in acquiring knowledge, skills, and understanding. Okay, so that's the scope of this particular workshop. And now we'll go to our first question that we're going to be investigating for it. Do you want to go to the next slide, Rachel? Oops, wrong direction. So our first question is, should students start an open inquiry by writing their own big idea or conceptual understanding? So we're going to start this with a little bit of engagement from you, just to kind of take stock in the chat room. So in the chat, do you start an open inquiry, which might be like an exhibition if you're in the PYP or some other form of open inquiry project-based learning with students, by having the students write their own understandings? or by sharing a class big idea with them. If you have some kind of big idea that you want them to be investigating, but choosing ways that they're going to be doing that. And then why or why not. Okay, so take a moment. Do you start an open inquiry with students writing their own understanding? Why or why not? And I'm going to be looking at the chat and seeing what you come up with.
There's a slight delay of kind of 10 or 20 seconds coming through on the chat, Carla. So if you're not seeing it yet, give them a little time to type their responses.
Okay, I'll be patient. I'm going to use wait time plus 10.
Exactly. A little bit of extended wait time in this situation.
So Uni has just said that she doesn't do that. The big idea that they have is the destination. They can have their own understanding after exploring topics. Some others saying we do write understandings because they're in PYP1, they're very young. Another person saying, we want it to be inductive, not deductive. So we want them to not yet write the ideas. So we have kind of a mix here of some individuals saying, no, we will start with a big idea, a central idea, some understanding that we'll share with them, and others saying, no, we want the students to develop it themselves. So we kind of have two approaches there, and we're going to talk about that in this section today. So let's start by thinking about the process that we take as teachers in writing a unit. So when we write our own units, we start, when we want to work conceptually, by defining the conceptual understandings we want students to arrive at by the end of a unit of learning. And we do that because we want to make sure there's synergy between the topics we're choosing, so the factual knowledge we're choosing, the skills that we're choosing, and the big ideas we want students to arrive at by the end of the unit. So our common approach would be to say, what's our idea? What's the conceptual understanding students should have? What is the implication for me as a teacher in terms of my planning? Week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, as they're uncovering that conceptual understanding. So if that's the way that we approach it as teachers, it would be logical that we would want students to design an inquiry in the same way, right? If we're thinking, well, that's what teachers do to kind of clarify for themselves, it helps us with being intentional in terms of choosing our content, then surely in an open inquiry, we would do something similar so that they could choose their own content and figure out that destination of theirs. But when we talk about students developing conceptual understandings in a concept-based inquiry approach, what we're often talking about is employing an inductive approach. And that's the top kind of row of this diagram. We would want students to explore a range of factual examples in the form of case studies, experiments, reading lots of articles about something, going out and having experiences. And then from that immersion in factual content, they look for patterns, using questioning, using teacher facilitation to be able to come up with some big idea that now I understand that something is true based on the factual content that they've explored. If we ask our students at the beginning of an open inquiry to come up with their own idea, then basically what they're doing is an inquiry to validate the idea that they came up with at the very beginning of that unit. And in some cases, students don't necessarily have the conceptual schema to be able to develop an understanding that's strong enough to be able to be valid, not overgeneralized, to allow them to be able to find conceptual content that would then reflect that conceptual understanding. So it may actually end up solidifying misconceptions, which is something we would, of course, want to avoid with our students. So we would say that, can you go? Yeah. We would generally say that conceptual understandings are a planning tool for us because they help us represent ideas we have already understood, but that these ideas are those that students don't yet have, right? So if you haven't yet developed and understanding, it's very hard to create your own conceptual understanding in a written form. So we use it as a planning tool for us, but we wouldn't do that for students. And then with that, we want to think about some of the psychology around what we know with flow, and how we need to balance the skill level and challenge level for students. Conceptual understandings are extremely abstract because it is kind of a synthesis of factual learning that has been consolidated over time. You know, you see a pattern emerging from example, 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 and that allows you to be able to say, well, this is what I think is true based on that particular content. So that requires quite a lot of higher order thinking skills. And for some students, they excel with abstract conceptual thinking. And for other students, they actually need that factual grounding in content. And so what we would try to do is make sure that students begin their engagement with concrete examples, to make sure that we don't have the situation that the skill level that they have for abstract or higher order thinking is low, but the challenge level to be able to create a conceptual understanding is high. And then we create anxiety and worry for our students, as we would see in this flow diagram. What we want is synergy between the challenge level and the skill level. And by starting with the factual content, we can scaffold that over time. And Rachel will talk quite a bit more about the use of case studies to be able to do this. So just to summarize for this little question, before, we would maybe share the central idea or a statement of inquiry with students. And what we're advocating for in an open inquiry or any other form of inquiry that you might be engaging with is beginning with your questions and robust factual context first, something that can immerse the student and allow them to be able to see those patterns before requiring them to come up with an abstract idea right from the beginning of a unit. And then I think I'm passing over to Rachel for the next section.
You are. Thank you, Carla. So in the next session, we're going to address how we plan to develop understanding within an open inquiry, because a lot of teachers that I have worked with have developed a lot of confidence in building conceptual understandings for a guided inquiry or a structured inquiry. But when it comes to open inquiry, they just skip the whole developing conceptual understandings, and there's very little on the planner at all in terms of an open inquiry. And we can understand their argument in terms of, well, if it's an open inquiry and students are choosing their destination and I don't even know what their topic's going to be yet, how on earth can I plan something? It's just going to evolve as we teach the unit. But in actual fact, there's a lot that we need to support students with. And I came across this quote just from a book that I've been reading this last week, actually. It's called Mind Your Mindset. And they were saying, there are thoughts you cannot think, questions you cannot ask, and conclusions you cannot draw because they simply wouldn't occur to you. And the book's by Michael Hyatt and Megan Hyatt Miller. And this is something that really resonates with me because it's something that I've said quite a bit about student agency and about open inquiry, because we don't know what we don't know. And if we ask students to pick something and to plan out their unit and choose their case study or their topic that they want to explore, design all their questions, but they've got very little experience with the topic, then we're never going to get to a deep inquiry that's really going to support that flow, that high level of student agency. So we need to spend some time, even in an open inquiry, front-loading some case studies to explore possibilities. So let's look at how we can do that. I'm going to show you a little video in just a moment. Oh, 1 second. I might have to go back to that slide. I'm going to show you a little video, and it's from Catherine Deutsch's 5th grade class, where they were doing a unit around innovators. And the students ultimately got to choose an innovator that they were interested in finding out about. But before they did that, they had some mini case studies where the whole class had the opportunity to explore different types of innovators. Because as a class, they were looking at, 6 types of innovation or innovators. And they wanted to build a shared understanding of what is innovation or what innovators mean in order to then give students the opportunity to make choices. So we'll watch a little video from this class and then debrief on it.
I like the way you use this word sometimes, because I think it's important to consider that this definition has to apply to every innovator. It has to encompass all of those categories. Please find that new group, and now you have 4 minutes to come to a new definition there. And every inspires people to make new things, even if others are skeptical about the idea. Can I ask you a question, John? I want you to think about the innovators that you've studied and ask yourself if that definition would apply to every single innovator. So this one kind of goes for entrepreneurs. For a second. I want you to think about which part of the definition is giving you a problem, and maybe take turns explaining which part and why. How you drive people, innovator inspires people to make new things, even if others are skeptical about that. What I notice is that the children who are more interested in inventors or makers or coders tend to define innovation in a way that includes making something or producing something, whereas the children who are drawn to the leaders tend to define innovation in a slightly different way. Because we're looking at an all-encompassing definition of innovation that includes 6 different categories of innovators, it's really important that we come up with a definition that all students in the class understand. And that could be true for any of the innovators we might be discussing.
So you can see here from the work that students were doing, the initial work around innovators, they were still thinking about perhaps one type of innovator, but by really taking the time to explore different case studies of innovators and then investing time in building a shared understanding and negotiating that together in terms of what do we mean by innovation. When students got to the point where they were choosing their own case studies to explore within this, they really had much more depth and scope to be working with to make those informed choices about case studies. So I want to look at a couple more examples of this. Often when I'm working with schools, when they come to their PYP exhibition or their MYP personal project or other kind of open inquiry opportunities, the Sustainable Development Goals is a nice frame to create the scope for that unit. But if we're not investing time up front from the beginning of that unit in really deeply understanding what are the Sustainable Development Goals and what are some different case studies where people have been working actively towards those Sustainable Development Goals, and we launch too quickly right into that, choose your case study, let's design our investigation, how will we explore these ideas, then the inquiry tends to fall flat, or you'll have some of your students in the class who aren't able to choose something within that frame that really resonates with them, and it's going to sustain them through a longer period of open inquiry. So investing that time at the beginning of an open inquiry to sort of explore possibilities is so important in order to make that inquiry meaningful and to support students in having high ownership and agency in their learning. Here's another example. So this is from a human rights unit, and if we start a more open inquiry by just letting students choose human rights activists, then they're likely to all end up in the same kind of category of Martin Luther King or Gandhi or Nelson Mandela, because they don't know about necessarily all of the possibilities that they could explore within that. They may not know human rights activists from their own home countries, or they may not know human rights activists from today. So spending some time exploring not just historical examples of human rights activists, but also human rights activists who are still working today is so important to give students that grounding and give them a little bit of a taste of possibilities. And that's why planning for case studies is so important. One last example, and this one's a local one here for me. I was working with a team of teachers who were planning a very open inquiry, but the students had to, as an ultimate action, take some kind of action within their local community. But it was so important for those students to spend some time exploring what were the issues before they could choose an issue that resonated with them. So some issues that they looked at together as a whole class were this issue that has been dividing the local community here. I'm not sure that we've even actually reached a resolution, but all of the other towns around us have a skate park. But here in Greytown, we don't have a skate park. There has been land that has been 2 different possible sites that has been put aside for the possibility of developing a skate park. I believe there's also funding available, but there are locals in those areas who are concerned about the implications for their local area of a skate park. Right now, we're also seeing the cost of living increasing. I'm sure it's not just in New Zealand, it's all over the world, of the cost of food and just general cost of living. So there's huge pressure on food banks in the local community, and helping students to explore what that is and why that is and how that's changed over time. We also saw that huge pressure on food banks during the pandemic. And again, this is our local town doesn't have a food bank, and so we rely on food banks that are a little bit further away. So how can students get involved in that? And then this one is one that wasn't a part of this unit, but is very local. So this is an article that I found this week. We've quite a few parts of New Zealand have very recently been hit by Cyclone Gabriel, and a lot of us are really wondering, how can we help? Because those towns have very much been cut off. I was talking to a friend just this week who's involved in telecommunications, and they lost track of a helicopter for about 5 hours who'd gone in to set up, to try and reset up the internet. And so cell phone coverage is down, and it leaves the rest of us really feeling, how can we help? We feel so close and yet so far removed. And I wanted to bring this one up because in supporting open inquiry, but also in supporting transfer from other units, exploring current events with students is so important. And having some kind of protocol or procedure or routines in your classroom where you're regularly looking at current events with students does help students to make connections and to just become more informed citizens of the world, so that they can connect to, make suggestions, transfer their understanding, and having some of those discussions. So just kind of as a challenge or something to put back to you as a takeaway, I really encourage you to start to think about how you use current events in your classroom. And just as the kind of chat goes on, if you've got any great current event resources, we always love to kind of hear about what people are using. So pop into the chat any websites or any sources of information that you use to share current events with your students, just as a kind of reference for others who maybe don't necessarily know, because there are some great news channels that are designed specifically for children. So that's the case studies part. And planning intentionally for sharing case studies or front-loading case studies at the beginning of a unit really sets us up for a much richer and much more successful open inquiry, because students have explored and chosen intentionally a case study that really resonates with them. And once they've done that, they're able to sustain an inquiry because they've chosen something that A, there's going to be information about, and B, that resonates with them. The next part of this planning for inquiry is around the skill development. And I found this quote: "A wise man doesn't give the right answers, he poses the right questions." Informing questions is such an essential part of an open inquiry. Students need to take more responsibility for designing the guiding questions for their inquiry. But let me know in the chat, what skills do students need to be successful in an open inquiry classroom? Because we know that skill development is so important, but quite often there's not enough intentional thought into how we will scaffold or support the development of those skills within an open inquiry. And we also know that if students don't have those skills, the inquiry is likely to really stall, or students are going to have trouble being able to successfully navigate moving from a structured or guided inquiry into an open inquiry.
I might tell a little anecdote, Rachel, while you're waiting for those comments to come in, and it's about Catherine's classroom. I loved being in her classroom and her telling about how they front-loaded that unit, which was like their exhibition unit. And what they actually arranged was that every classroom had one focus on a type of innovator. And they came into that teacher's classroom with their notebook right at the beginning of the kind of exhibition time. And it was a chance for them to learn some of those note-taking skills and to practice setting up their exhibition notebook and kind of training the kids about what it meant in terms of their personal responsibility to be mindful of the information shared, to really be thinking about what they would want to capture and how they would capture that on the page. And it's a nice example of how the introduction of the case studies can intersect with skill development right at the beginning of an open inquiry, so that they do get some of that factual content, but you're also helping them to understand kind of the requirements in terms of skill that they're going to need to bring to be successful in an open inquiry.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you for sharing that, Carla, because you're absolutely right. That time at the beginning where we're front loading is also a beautiful time for skill development. And I've often said, sometimes we see teachers who will have a skill development unit at the beginning of the year before they will launch into any topic. And I always find that when you're trying to teach skills completely out of context with no content to work with, then it really makes that skill development much more challenging to teach and much less engaging for students. And it makes the transfer more challenging for students if they're not working with some meaningful content as they're developing those skills. And so we're seeing in the chat, in terms of skills that students need to be successful with an inquiry, quite a few people saying the ATL skills. And for those who are not familiar with ATL, it's the approaches to learning skills in the IB programs, which are research skills, communication skills, thinking skills, social skills. So definitely they are self-management skills. They are very important in supporting students in an open inquiry. There need to be risk takers, a little open-minded. They need research skills. And then they need to be taught in a progression throughout the entire school. Yeah, someone saying that the exhibition or open inquiry is incredibly challenging if we don't have that support of these skills. And it becomes actually just a really stressful time for teachers and students if we don't have that skill development in place. So one way to support this in terms of understanding skill development is to actually use some of our strategies that we would be using in a concept-based inquiry approach around concept formation. So here's an example of a classroom that we're doing research questions and looking at that in more depth. So what is a good research question and what is not a good research question? And the teacher made some prompts for the students and then they had to support it. But again, looking at a particular context. So those prompts were as if the students were doing a unit around animal rights and neglect of animals. And so the questions in terms of what would support a good research question for that unit were still sorted by the students. And then from that, they were asked what makes a good research question. So instead of going straight into the more abstract, what makes a good research question, spending time exploring examples and non-examples. So using those same principles that we use in a concept-based classroom, where we go back to the factual examples and we explore the actual questions. Is this a good question? No. And listening to the conversations that students are having as they're doing that sort, then is able to lead into a bigger question of what makes a good research question. And together the class compiled a list of what would make a good research question. And then this is an example at a much higher grade level. This is one that's in our book. It's an 11th grade example from Julia Briggs' class, where the science group, and they're actually using the question stretch, one of the question stretch strategies that we share in our book to sort their questions. So actually giving students an opportunity to spend time on developing questions, sorting and categorizing those questions, deciding which questions are meaningful is so important, because that those questions are going to set students up for success. And then I mentioned at the beginning of this section, if we're going to plan a unit for an open inquiry, sometimes the conceptual understandings can feel a little challenging, because if we don't know the destination and students are all choosing diverse and different topics, what kinds of conceptual understandings can we use? And so I've got here 3 understandings that come from different open inquiry units. The first one is actually from a group of teachers who are working with 4-year-olds at Frankfurt International School. And it was an attempt to make their science unit more open so that they could explore lots of different scientific experiments throughout the year. And so they came up with this understanding: people learn about the world by asking questions, observing, and experimenting. Sure. Or we could have a conceptual understanding around a strong research question focuses the investigation and guides the design and method. Or for our older students, we might have an understanding around correct citation helps an author establish credibility and supports the argument the author is making. So you can see here that these are articulating the bigger understandings that come from the development of skills and strategies. And it's so important that we're investing time in articulating the progression here. Because if we don't, what we tend to see is the same understandings being taught at each grade level, and we're not necessarily getting the increasing complexity and specificity in the skill development. We should be able to talk about and explain and document in our written curriculum what research questions looks like, or what's the new understanding around research questions for our 6-year-olds, for our 10-year-olds, for our 15-year-olds, and for our 18-year-olds. How does that change as students get older and as they progress through the grade levels? So when we're working in a unit that has a lot of content, we would have many more of our understandings based on the knowledge of that unit. But when we're working in a more open inquiry, where the content understanding students will be writing themselves at the end of the unit, and we can't necessarily plan for, we have to scaffold that from their own questions. The understandings that we'll be designing at the beginning of the unit will be largely around the processes, strategies, and skills that we want to support within that unit. And then I found this quote from Ron Berger. It's, as students are given the tools to understand and assess their strengths and challenges, their ability to take ownership increases. And that really resonates with me, because ultimately an open inquiry is about taking more ownership for their learning and giving students more choice to explore something that really resonates with them. But in order for that to be successful, it is our responsibility as educators to make sure they have the tools to understand and assess their own strengths and challenges, the tools to, or the skills in place to be successful in that. Otherwise, we're not going to get that ownership or that agency that we're looking for from an open inquiry. Back to you, Carla.
All right. So we can imagine we've gone through an open inquiry with our students. They're super passionate about whatever they've investigated, and they want to take action. So how do we support purposeful student action? So we're going to talk about this aspect of an open inquiry now. So we're going to show you first a quote from Zoe Weil from the Center for Humane Education. If you don't know the Center for Humane Education, it's a great website that they have lots of teaching strategies explicitly for, the investigation of issues, whether they be ecological or human. And she talks a lot about creating solutionaries, and that's her term for change makers. And so she talks about solutionary solutions. And she says that these are all about them reflecting a deep understanding of the complexities of the problem, its causes, and the underlying systems that perpetuate it, strives not to harm people, animals, or the environment, and seeks to avoid unintended negative consequences, and works to positively transform the underlying systems that perpetuate the problem. So we can see from this quote, when we're thinking about student action that is fitting into this definition of solutionary solutions, there's no way at the beginning of an open inquiry, week one, when they choose their topic or whatever problem or sustainable development goal that they're going to investigate, that they can decide what action they're going to be able to take. Because an understanding of systems that perpetuate or produce particular problems in the world requires such a deep level of understanding that takes weeks to develop through the course of an inquiry. So I'd really see that student action in an open inquiry comes as a result of conceptual understanding. And that's really the way that Rachel and I have articulated it in our concept-based inquiry model. And we'll just show you quickly that model so that you can see it again if you haven't, gotten the chance to get up close and personal with it. So in our concept-based inquiry model, we talk about the fact that we want students to go through a process where they engage by connecting emotionally or intellectually to the content of a unit or the concepts of a unit. We want to focus that unit through concept formation, where we're being really clear about those driving concepts of a unit, such as innovator or ecosystem or something else. Then we go through a process of investigation, either where the class is all exploring the same case study or where they're investigating different case studies. They go through that process of investigation, use organizing strategies such as graphic organizers, questions, etc., to be able to form their own generalizations. So generalizations are those statements of conceptual understanding, what we would call central ideas in the PYP, or statement of inquiry in the MYP, or big idea or essential understanding, or whatever other term you want for it. But in Lynn Erickson and Lois Lanning's terminology for this, we call them generalizations. And then at the end, we would want students to take those generalizations and transfer them to new situations and contexts. And one of the ways that we talk about this is that students take action in the world around them. Can you go to the next slide, Rachel? So these are the 4 ways that we talk about students taking transfer and kind of investigate or enacting conceptual understandings of the units. So they might be testing and justifying their generalizations. For example, they get a new case study, a news article, then they're connecting to that with their generalization. They might be making predictions or hypotheses based on new phenomena that they're looking at or scenarios that they might be given. They might be understanding new situations and events, or they might be applying their learning and taking action through either direct action, indirect action, advocacy, or research for action, which is Kathy Berger Kay's way of organizing action, or service learning, which she calls. In the Worldwise Learning Cycle, we have a similar model that very much builds from concept-based inquiry and action, and we talk about connecting, understanding, and acting. I'm going to give a short case study of one unit so that you can see what this looks like in practice, and then show the action that some students took and relate it to this idea of the students connecting to a particular issue, being able to deeply understand that issue, and then to act by developing what So Wild calls solutionary solutions, or solutions that look to address complexities and the systems that perpetuate issues in the world. And then we'll talk about kind of the relationship between these bits and pieces. So I'm going to show you here a sample unit. It's a kindergarten unit. And this unit was more of a guided inquiry unit as opposed to an open inquiry unit, because we did have a destination for students, but they're 5. So open inquiry can sometimes be a little bit tricky with younger students, depending on their skills and abilities. So in this particular unit, we started with a lot of connection or engagement, as we would call it in concept-based inquiry. And that meant that students went to a local pollinator garden, and not just once, but they went multiple times and looked for pollinators and other creatures that lived there. So you can see on the left here, one student kind of finding a fat green and white caterpillar. And the great thing was, because we went multiple times to this garden, they started developing relationships with these creatures where they could kind of anticipate where they were in the garden. They started seeing them changing. They would look for, that when they went into the pupa, to be able to identify the life cycle changes that were occurring. And at the same time as they were making these observations, they were able to start seeing relationships that exist within a habitat. So you can see here on the right, all of these different photos of, spiders and wasps and butterflies and different flowering plants. These are all photos that the kids took when they were in the garden. So they, once they had engaged in some kind of open-ended observation, we started bringing cameras. They started photographing the different creatures that lived there. And then what they started doing was systems mapping, actually identifying the interconnectedness between these organisms, how they relate to each other. And what they started to see were relationships like predator-prey relationships, or competition between different organisms. So the fact that we had some birds and also the butterflies that were both nectar drinking animals, or you had some animals that were being eaten by multiple animals, like the caterpillars were being eaten by birds. These horrible invasive species, the myna, which should not live in Singapore, but it does. They were eating all the caterpillars and then also these lizards. So they had identified all these and then at the same time understood what the role of pollinators were in our food kind of production system by doing some research within the classroom. And then we also went to the local supermarket and looked at the ways that insects were being represented on different products. And so we did some critical analysis of labels where they went and they took photographs of any products they could find that had insects represented on them. And then we did a paired text strategy back in the classroom to look at the way that insects are represented and what that meant in terms of how humans should interact with them. So you had the ants or the roaches, always, they were represented as like black and kind of dead or on their back or something very negative. And then of course, the bees were always, smile and super cartoony and happy. And they were able to see that, these different animals were treated differently through the products. And this kind of really upset them that there would be different rules for different insects based on the fact that people like eating honey, but somehow see that ants are a pest. And they really developed empathy and kind of criticality around this activity. So then in terms of the action that they wanted to take, a lot of it came from them when they were starting to see the needs of these different creatures in our community. This was in Singapore, and Singapore is green, but it's also a very small and urban environment. And these animals need kind of like way stations to be able to get from one place to the other. So the kids were really passionate about collecting the pupa once the caterpillar had already gone into the pupa, to take them and to put them into a butterfly mesh, which you can see here on the left, so that they wouldn't be eaten by the mynas or the lizards, because they felt quite passionate that they should be able to get into the end of their life cycle. And they also saw the need for flowering plants and host plants for the caterpillars. So this butterfly on the left is a lime butterfly. So they lay their eggs on the lime plant, and then the lime caterpillars eat the lime leaves, and then it just, goes in a cycle. So they developed parts of the garden. They suggested, new plants to be able to plant there. And so we really saw lots of stewardship behaviors from these 5-year-olds, kind of a commitment to nonviolence, which I think, young kids, you can sometimes see if they don't have a connection to mini beasts or insects, you can sometimes see them smashing them or stepping on them or doing other things to them during playtime. They had this real kind of stance of nonviolence, and then also the garden development that came with this. So we're going to give you another chance to do a little reflection. So we shared that definition from Zoe Weil about solutionary solutions, about having deep understanding of the systems that produce particular issues in the world. How do you think that these particular actions, the stewardship behaviors with collecting the pupa so that the butterflies would be able to make it to adulthood and be released into the community, and also the development of the garden and the nonviolent stance. How do you think that that reflects students' conceptual understanding about pollinators, habitats, and life cycles? So why don't you take a moment to put that into the chat, and we will take a look at what you think there.
Carla, as they're typing away furiously, there's a few comments and things in the chat around the local connection. So do you want to speak a little bit to that idea of the local connection and to what extent students choose where they're going in an open inquiry, to what extent as adults we need to facilitate opportunities? I know that when I've worked with teachers and there's one of the challenges with the open inquiry where students are sometimes going different directions can be, managing those trips into different places and still making sure that students can get on field trips and more open inquiries.
Yep. I feel so passionately about the local. So there's a wonderful author who's at Antioch University who talks a lot about place-based learning. And he gives a quote, which is, first, no catastrophes before fourth grade, which I think is wonderful because it's about inspiring a local connection and a love for the world so that students don't become apathetic or think that problems are too big for them. And he shares one example where it was a bird unit somewhere in New Hampshire or something like that. And the first thing they did was they went out, and it was, again, I think a young group of kids, maybe grade 1 or grade 2. They went out and they started making some observations. And then he said, oh, let's make some wings, and they cut out wings with cardboard, but he didn't ask them to do any pick a bird from a book and, replicate the colors and all that. And then he says, let's pretend to be birds. And so they ran around with their wings. And he said that over time, then they started to notice birds and want to represent them on their wings. And so then they started developing a connection to specific species that were in that forest and said, oh, that's my bird. And I think when we get kids to the point where they feel that connection to species, and we can strengthen their citizenship behaviors, because we often talk about global citizenship as this thing that happens out here, but it has to start with the local environment. And so I would say in an open inquiry, you always want to try to choose a context where the child can take direct action in their community, because otherwise they start to lose the sense of agency or ownership that they might have over that learning, because it starts feeling, too far afield. And then you get the poster boards with posters around the school of, this is a problem, but it becomes a little bit of a passive relationship. I will come back to the chat. So we had some connections about real life, local connections, like they make meaning for themselves and start taking action on their own. Absolutely, they did in this particular case. And then there was a question about what kind of inquiry was this. This is more of a guided inquiry than an open inquiry, but these are 5-year-olds. So I think you could do something similar in an open inquiry. You just need to scaffold the experiences that they're having in the environment. And if you can use your school and local community as an environment, it doesn't mean that they're going, and hopefully it becomes more manageable in terms of the staffing. So just in terms of the connection to the conceptual understandings here, I'll just draw some explicit relationships. They had already understood that life cycles, they go from, at least in the butterfly case, from the egg, the caterpillar, the pupa, and to adult. And they understood that adults were the ones that were needed to make more eggs, to make more caterpillars. And they understood that if you didn't have the adults reaching adulthood, like if they were in the pupa and then something happened with Mina, then the life cycle would stop. And so they actually put those intentional behaviors in to try to make sure that they did make it through the whole life cycle. So I think that really showed that conceptual understanding. they also really understood that pollinators need flowering plants. That's what they need in terms of their nutrition. And so they thought about how they could do that, and also the relationships between different organisms, because they understood predator-prey relationships. And that's why they started to say, oh, we need to put the butterfly in the mesh and protect it and make sure it can get to adulthood so it doesn't get eaten.